Good evening. Tonight our story is the rise and fall of the Napoleonic Empire. We aren't going to focus on loud, cinematic battles. Instead, we are going to trace the slow, methodical breakdown of a military system that was mathematically doomed from the start. Before we begin, take a moment to let go of the day. Lower the brightness on your screen, pull up the blankets, and let these historical details serve as your white noise. Close your eyes, and let's begin. The French Empire did not begin with a crown. It began with a ledger. Before the first cannon was fired, the French Revolution performed a massive, violent system cleanup of the state's internal wiring. To understand why the French army became a world-conquering machine, we must first look at the administrative guillotine. This was the process of deleting the old, inefficient code of the monarchy. It replaced it with a cold, data-driven meritocracy. In the Old World, the world of the Bourbons and the Habsburgs, the military was a social club for the rich. A general did not need to understand math, geometry, or logistics. He only needed a famous last name and a deep pocketbook. Command positions were private property. They were bought and sold like real estate. This created a massive lag in the system. Information traveled slowly. Orders were ignored by arrogant aristocrats. The biological hardware, the soldiers, were treated as expensive, shiny toys. They were not functional tools. When a noble general made a mistake, the system protected him. Errors were buried under layers of social etiquette. The revolution struck in 1789. It killed the king. More importantly, it killed the amateur leader. The new republic was surrounded by enemies. It had zero room for error. It required a system that actually worked. The administrative guillotine was the solution. This was a brutal filter. If a commander failed to produce results, he was removed. Often, he was executed. This was not a pursuit of justice. It was a clearing of the cache. It ensured that only those who could solve the problems of the battlefield remained in the circuit. The system optimized itself through attrition. The biological debt of a failed general was paid in full at the scaffold. The state then standardized the map. The chaotic, ancient provinces of France were deleted. They were replaced by 83 departments of roughly equal size. Each one was designed so that a citizen could reach the capital of the department in a single day's ride. This was a hardware upgrade for the government. It allowed the central processing unit in Paris to send and receive data, orders, taxes, and conscription numbers, with a speed that no other country could compute. France was no longer a patchwork of different laws. It was a unified grid. Every department functioned like a standardized module in a larger machine. Within this grid, the French introduced the metric system. Before this, a pound or a foot changed in value from one town to the next. For an army trying to calculate food for 100,000 men, this was a mathematical disaster. Standardization solved the friction. The French bureaucracy finally spoke a single language. 1 ton of gunpowder was now exactly 1 ton of gunpowder. This allowed for the mass production of military assets. When every bolt and every barrel followed the same metric specifications, the machine could be repaired in the field with interchangeable parts. The transition to industrial war had begun. The chaos of human measurement was replaced by the cold precision of the meter. Napoleon Bonaparte was the perfect expression of this new, optimized hardware. He arrived as a technical specialist. He was an artillery officer. His noble rank was a footnote. He viewed the world through the lens of a mathematician. He ignored the glory of his bloodline. He prioritized the angle of a slope, the weight of a shell, and the number of shoes in a warehouse. He was a piece of software designed specifically to run on the new Republican hardware. He did not lead men, he managed a kinetic network. The revolution gave him the levée en masse. This was the first true mass conscription system in human history. The state moved away from small professional armies. They were too expensive to lose. The French state turned the entire population into a resource pool. The bureaucracy developed a system to track every male between the ages of 18 and 25. Every young man was a soldier. Every woman was a factory worker. Every old man was a voice for the state. This created a kinetic network of millions. The state now had access to a nearly infinite supply of biological hardware. The biological cost was irrelevant. The state now owned the population as a measurable resource. It could afford to lose 50,000 men in a single afternoon. It simply replaced them with new data points the next morning. The administrative guillotine had turned France into a factory for war. It was a leaner, faster, and more ruthless engine than anything the world had ever seen. The aristocrats of Europe looked at this machine and saw the mob. Napoleon looked at it and saw a weapon that could be pointed at the heart of the continent. He calculated that an army of 500,000 men, managed by a standardized bureaucracy, would always delete an army of 50,000 men managed by a handful of cousins. The old world was a collection of clocks. Each ticked at a different speed. The French Empire was a single, massive engine. It was synchronized by the state and ready to be driven to the point of collapse. The kingdom of people had become a system of numbers. The traditional 18th century army was a slow, bloated organism. It was tethered to a leash called the supply train. If a general wanted to move 50,000 units of biological hardware, he was forced to drag thousands of heavy wagons filled with flour, salt, and fodder. These wagons were pulled by oxen and horses that also required fuel. The result was a logistical paradox. The more food you carried to keep the army operational, the slower the army moved. The more food it consumed just to sustain its own weight. Most wars of that era were not won on the battlefield. They were lost while waiting for bread ovens to be built at the rear. Napoleon's primary logistical hack was the deletion of the leash. He realized that the European landscape was not merely dirt and trees. It was a vast battery of stored energy. Every barn, every granary, and every field of wheat was a fuel source. He decided that his army would no longer carry its life support. Instead, it would harvest that support as it moved. This was the birth of the caloric engine. To make this engine work, the system required constant motion. If 100,000 men remain in a single geographic coordinate for too long, they deplete the local resource pool and the system stalls. The Napoleonic algorithm required high-velocity movement. The army stayed spread out. It marched on parallel roads like the fingers of a stretched hand. This allowed each individual unit to tap into a different fuel tank of local farms. They moved through a province. They stripped the calories, the grain, the cattle, the wine. They converted that biological fuel into mileage. This was a brutal, mathematical reality for the civilian populations in the path of the machine. To the French High Command, a village was not a collection of families. It was a data point representing 10,000 rations. If the math dictated that the army needed 20,000 calories to reach the next river, the soldiers extracted them. There was no room for heroism in this equation. If the local population experienced a total caloric collapse as a result, it was simply an external cost of the engine's operation. The army did not forage in the romantic sense. It performed a systematic harvest of the landscape's kinetic potential. By removing the supply wagons, Napoleon increased the clock speed of warfare. His enemies were still calculating how many mules were needed to move a single regiment. Meanwhile, the French units were already 30 miles behind their lines. The French soldier became a piece of high-efficiency hardware. He carried a small reserve of hard bread. For everything else, he was an apex predator of calories. He was trained to grind his own grain. He baked his own soul cake in the ashes of a campfire. He was a mobile processing unit that could find fuel in environments where other armies would starve. This caloric independence gave the French a massive latency advantage. They reacted to enemy movements before the enemy network even registered their presence. They were not tethered to fixed supply depots. They moved across mountains and through forests that were previously considered impassable. They turned the geography of Europe into a high-speed highway. They were no longer limited by the speed of a mule. They were limited only by the endurance of their own legs. The most demanding components of this network were the horses. A single cavalry regiment required tons of forage daily just to keep the sensors of the army operational. If the grass was too thin or the hay was burned, the cavalry collapsed. This would blind the entire network. The system required a constant, high-density intake of green fodder and oats. However, this engine had a hard-coded flaw. It required a specific environment to function. It needed high-density terrain, rich farmland, dense villages, and stored harvests. The math worked perfectly in the lush valleys of northern Italy or the golden fields of Germany. The system was built on the assumption that there would always be something to harvest. It was a machine that had to eat to move. It also had to move to eat. The foraging radius of a single corps was approximately 5 to 10 miles from the main road. If the army was forced to concentrate for a battle, the caloric demand spiked. If the battle lasted more than 48 hours, the local energy pool would be drained to zero. This meant that the French machine was programmed for the decisive battle. It had to strike fast. It had to win. It had to move on to the next battery of grain. It could not afford a stalemate. A stalemate meant starvation. For years, the math held up. The French moved like a swarm of locusts. They turned the agricultural wealth of Europe into a series of lightning-fast victories. They outwalked, outpaced, and outlived every professional army that tried to fight them with old-fashioned wagons. They had turned the very act of eating into a weapon. But the system was fragile. It was a high-performance engine that required a constant intake of external fuel. The moment the machine entered a geographic void, a place where the calories had been erased, the hardware would begin to consume itself. The caloric engine was a masterpiece of efficiency. It was also a countdown. The ultimate physical limit of ancient warfare was the width of the road. Before the Napoleonic era, moving an army of 100,000 men was a geometric nightmare. If 100,000 men march down a single dirt track, the resulting column is nearly 30 miles long. The front of the army arrives at the battlefield days before the rear. This was the traffic jam of antiquity. It made large-scale movement slow and predictable. It made the entire army vulnerable to interception. Napoleon solved this through a structural reorganization of the military's architecture. He introduced the corps d'armée. He broke the massive, unmanageable block of the army into several self-sustaining mini-armies called corps. Each corps was a modular network. It contained its own infantry, its own cavalry, and its own organic artillery. It was designed to function independently for 24 to 48 hours without support. It carried its own internal logic. The distributed network allowed the French machine to bypass the limits of the road. Instead of one 30-mile column, Napoleon utilized 5 or 6 parallel roads. He spread his corps across a front that could be 60 or 70 miles wide. To the enemy's intelligence network, the French appeared to be fragmented. This was a deception of the eyes. In reality, they were synchronized by a strict mathematical protocol. The rule was simple. March divided, fight united. This was a data management breakthrough. By spreading out, the Corps could harvest calories more efficiently. They were not competing for the same barns and fields. More importantly, they could move at a higher frequency. Each road was only carrying 20,000 men. The drag of a massive march was deleted. The French system flowed through the geography of Europe like water through a sieve. Meanwhile, the enemy remained clumped in a single, slow-moving mass. The formation they used was known as the Bataillon Carré, or the Square Battalion. The Corps marched in a massive, loose square. No matter which direction the enemy attacked from, one corps would always be there to meet them. That corps acted as a fixing agent. Its only job was to lock the enemy in place. It absorbed the shock of the attack. It was a sacrificial component if necessary. While the enemy was busy fighting one segment of the network, the other corps began to converge on the coordinate. This convergence was enabled by the Berthier staff system. Louis-Alexandre Berthier was the chief of staff. He functioned as the network's central processing unit. He operated a massive bureaucratic office that translated Napoleon's strategic intent into thousands of individual data packets. These orders were copied and carried by high-speed couriers. The Berthier system was designed to handle the packet loss of war. If one courier was captured, 3 more were sent. This ensured that every independent corps remained in the loop. The system relied on the perfect calibration of time and distance. Each corps commander was given a specific arrival time for the target coordinate. The math was calculated based on the marching speed of infantry, approximately 3 miles per hour, and the terrain variables. If a corps arrived too early, it risked being destroyed alone. If it arrived too late, the fixing force would be annihilated. The goal was operational convergence. All fingers of the hand had to close into a fist at the exact same moment. This created a net that closed around the opponent. By the time the enemy general realized he was fighting only a fraction of the French army, the other segments were already closing behind him. The French were not just fighting. They were out-calculating the enemy's ability to react. They replaced the line of battle with a network of contact. They made the battlefield a fluid, moving grid. The Corps d'Armée was the final death of the 18th century style of war. It turned the army into a flexible, multi-headed organism. It allowed Napoleon to surround entire armies without ever fighting a major battle. At the city of Ulm in 1805, he used this network to trap 60,000 Austrians. He did not charge their lines. He simply moved his network around them until their supply lines were severed. Their kinetic potential was reduced to 0. They surrendered because they had run out of space to move. The traffic jam had been solved by mathematics. The road to total European dominance was now open. The French machine was no longer a single object. It was a distributed cloud of kinetic energy. It could move faster, eat more, and strike harder than any monarch's army in history. The logic of the network had won. Napoleon Bonaparte was not a swordsman. He was an artillery mathematician. In the French military system, the infantry provided the mass and the cavalry provided the sensors, but the artillery provided the kinetic output. To Napoleon, a battlefield was a geometric grid where the primary goal was the physical disintegration of enemy hardware. He did not view cannons as support weapons. He viewed them as industrial tools designed to create a vacuum in the enemy's line. The efficiency of this system relied on the Gribeauval standard. Before the Revolution, cannons were heavy, mismatched, and difficult to move. Jean-Baptiste de Gribeauval updated the hardware. He standardized the calibers into 4, 8, and 12 pounders. He made the parts interchangeable. If a wheel broke on a 12-pounder in the middle of a mud-soaked field in Poland, a replacement could be pulled from any other 12-pounder in the network. This was the first instance of industrial interchangeability on the battlefield. It reduced the maintenance lag of the army and allowed the kinetic engines to remain operational under extreme stress. Napoleon's tactical innovation was the grand battery. In the Old World, cannons were spread thin across the front to support individual infantry units. Napoleon deleted this decentralized model. He began massing his engines into a single massive battery at a specific coordinate. He would concentrate 50, 80, or 100 cannons onto a single point of the enemy line. This was a calculation of impact density. The goal was to exceed the structural integrity of the enemy's biological hardware. By focusing all kinetic energy on a narrow front, the French artillery would turn organized infantry squares into disorganized debris. The physics of the 12-pounder were precise. At a range of 600 to 900 meters, a round shot did not simply hit one man. It functioned as a high-velocity projectile that would skip along the ground, a process called ricochet fire. F equals ma. The force was equal to the mass of the iron ball multiplied by its acceleration. A single 12-pound ball skipping through a dense infantry formation could neutralize 20 units of biological hardware in a single bounce. It was a bowling ball hitting a set of pins made of flesh and bone. Napoleon understood the math of the bounce. He would wait for the ground to dry, as he famously did at Waterloo, specifically so the soil would be hard enough to facilitate the ricochet. If the ground was mud, the kinetic energy was absorbed by the earth. If the ground was hard, the energy was transferred into the enemy. The ammunition was also modular. For long-range disintegration, the battery used round shot. As the enemy drew closer, the crews switched to canister. This was a tin can filled with iron balls. When fired, the can disintegrated, turning the cannon into a giant industrial-scale shotgun. A single discharge of canister could delete an entire platoon in a fraction of a second. This was the short-range hack that Napoleon used to defend his own lines and shatter the final remnants of an enemy charge. This geometry required a massive logistical subsystem. A single 12-pounder cannon required 15 horses and a crew of 8 to 15 men to remain operational. It consumed vast quantities of gunpowder and iron. The Berthier staff system had to calculate the consumption rate of the batteries weeks in advance. If the ammunition wagons fell behind the caloric engine, the kinetic output of the army dropped to zero. Napoleon used his artillery to create what he called the event. He would hammer a specific point in the enemy line until the hardware was broken. Then, and only then, would he send in the infantry to occupy the hole created by the math. He did not ask his men to be heroes. He asked his cannons to be efficient. The battlefield was simply a series of angles, weights, and velocities. When the geometry was correct, victory was the only possible output. The Battle of Austerlitz is often categorized by traditional historians as a masterpiece of tactical deception. From a systems perspective, it is more accurately described as a flawless manipulation of topography and timing. It was a cold calculation designed to bait the Russo-Austrian network into a fatal movement. Napoleon did not win through bravery. He won because he understood the physics of the central position and the limits of coalition command latency. The operation began with a deliberate reduction of the French network's apparent strength. Napoleon purposely weakened his right flank, leaving a glaring gap near the village of Telnitz. To the coalition command, Tsar Alexander and Emperor Francis, this appeared to be a catastrophic error in deployment. They calculated that a massive strike against the French right would sever Napoleon's link to Vienna and collapse his entire logistical tail. They were following a standard military logic. Napoleon was operating on a higher-level algorithm. He was not protecting his flank. He was offering it as a sacrifice to trigger a specific enemy movement. He knew that if the coalition committed their mass to his right flank, they would have to drain the center of their own line to provide the necessary weight. This center was anchored on a geographic feature called the Pratzen Heights. The heights functioned as the server of the coalition position. They provided the elevation and the line of sight required for command and control. By baiting the enemy to move off the heights, Napoleon was essentially forcing them to leave their most critical defensive node unprotected. He was waiting for the coalition to move their biological hardware away from the topographical sensor that allowed them to see the battlefield. The timing of the counterstrike was synchronized with the arrival of the Third Corps under Marshal Davout. This unit had just completed a forced march of nearly 70 miles in 48 hours. This was the ultimate stress test for the caloric engine. They arrived at the exact coordinate on the right flank just as the coalition attack began. Their role was to act as a kinetic buffer. They were not ordered to win. They were ordered to absorb the energy of the coalition mass and lock it in place. While the coalition was grinding its elite hardware against Davout's defense, the center of their line at the Pratzen Heights became a hollow vacuum. At the precise moment of maximum coalition commitment, Napoleon triggered the event. He ordered Soult's Fourth Corps to storm the Pratzen Heights. The French units emerged from a heavy morning fog. This was a meteorological variable Napoleon had factored into his deployment. The fog masked the movement of the French mass until they were within range of the summit. The French seized the high ground in less than an hour. The coalition network was now physically severed. The fingers of their army were still attacking the French right, but the brain and center of their position had been deleted. The coalition army was now a fragmented system. It could no longer coordinate its movements. The communication loop between the Russian and Austrian units was severed by the French occupation of the center. Napoleon then pivoted his mass from the heights to strike the rear of the coalition columns. This was the phase of disintegration. The coalition troops, trapped between Davout's buffer and Soult's hammer, experienced a total breakdown of organizational logic. The retreat turned into a chaotic flight. The hardware was still present, but the software, the discipline and command, had crashed. The final calculation occurred at the Satshan Ponds. As the retreating coalition units attempted to cross the frozen water, Napoleon ordered his grand battery to fire round shot, not at the men, but at the ice. This was an exercise in structural engineering. He used the kinetic energy of his 12-pounders to break the ice's surface tension. He turned the geography itself into a lethal variable. Hundreds of units of biological hardware were neutralized by the freezing water. The math of the ice was more efficient than the math of the musket. Austerlitz was the perfect algorithm. Napoleon had used the coalition command's own aggression against them. He had manipulated the terrain to create a vacuum, and then filled that vacuum with a concentrated strike. By the end of the day, the Third Coalition had ceased to exist as a functional entity. The French system had processed and deleted an entire opposing network in less than 10 hours. The survivors were no longer soldiers, they were disorganized data points scattered across the Bohemian landscape. The algorithm had achieved its goal, the system reset. By 1806, the French military system had defeated every major land army in Europe. However, one absolute geographic obstacle remained. The English Channel was a physical barrier of cold, deep water that the French infantry could not march across. The British Royal Navy controlled the ocean. Napoleon could not apply his standard kinetic force. He could not move his artillery into London. Instead, he attempted to apply his logistical rules to the entire European economy. This was the Continental System. It was a massive, continent-wide blockade designed to starve the British economy. It was an attempt to turn the geography of the coastline into a weapon. The goal was to prevent any British goods from entering any European port. It was an embargo on a scale never before attempted. The French state ordered all Allied and conquered territories to close their docks to British shipping. If Britain could not sell its manufactured goods, it could not acquire the gold and silver necessary to fund the armies of Napoleon's enemies. The French strategy was to drain the British treasury by cutting off its physical revenue stream. It was an economic siege enforced by military threat. The continental system was mathematically flawed from the beginning. It required the perfect administration of thousands of miles of jagged coastline. The French state attempted to manage this massive physical border with a bureaucracy of customs clerks and tax inspectors. These clerks were heavily underpaid and stationed far from central authority. They were tasked with stopping a natural human economic drive. The local populations across Europe still required cheap British textiles, sugar, and coffee. The demand for these goods remained high. The legal supply was reduced to zero. This massive imbalance created an explosion of smuggling. Smuggling was the physical friction of a failed administrative policy. Thousands of small boats crossed the Channel and the Baltic Sea at night. They bypassed the French customs patrols. Goods were unloaded in hidden coves. They were transported inland on the backs of mules and men through unmapped mountain passes. The French bureaucracy could not move fast enough to stop this decentralized, fluid movement of cargo. The customs clerks were easily bribed. The economic incentive to ignore the blockade was simply too high. The administrative system leaked massive amounts of capital and resources every single night. The blockade caused more physical damage to the European continent than it did to Britain. It cut off European merchants from the global maritime market. Port cities like Bordeaux, Amsterdam, and Hamburg suffered severe economic depressions. Massive stone warehouses sat entirely empty. Cargo ships rotted at their moorings. The French state was attempting to replace the global ocean economy with a closed overland loop managed entirely from Paris. This overland shift ignored the basic physics of transport. The internal dirt roads of Europe were not capable of handling the heavy volume of transport required to replace ocean shipping. A single wooden merchant ship could carry 500 tons of cargo, propelled entirely by the wind. To move that same 500 tons overland required 500 wagons and 1,000 heavy draft horses. Those horses required thousands of pounds of grain and water every day just to generate the kinetic energy to pull the wagons. A wagon moving goods across the Alps consumed massive amounts of caloric energy and time compared to a ship sailing the Mediterranean. The physical infrastructure of Europe could not support Napoleon's economic rules. The transport costs skyrocketed, and the continental economy stalled. To enforce this impossible blockade, the French military was forced into constant motion. Every time a hole appeared in the coastline, Napoleon had to send soldiers to plug it. He annexed independent territories simply to gain control of their docks. The army was no longer massing for a single, decisive battle. It was dispersed across thousands of miles to act as heavily armed customs police. Infantry regiments were forced to stand on freezing beaches, staring at the water instead of training or resting. This vast dispersal broke the fundamental rule of French military success. They sacrificed the concentration of mass to chase smugglers. The continental system was the direct cause of the empire's terminal physical exhaustion. It was the primary reason the French army was ordered into the Iberian Peninsula in 1808. Portugal refused to close its ports to British ships. The French marched south to close the Portuguese ports by physical force. This action triggered the endless, grinding guerrilla war of the Spanish Ulcer. 4 years later, the Russian Empire also refused to maintain the economic blockade. The Russian economy was starving without British trade. This refusal was the direct trigger for the 1812 invasion. The French state destroyed its own military force, trying to enforce an economic rule that defied the physical and geographic realities of the European continent. They attempted to govern the ocean using infantry, and the resulting friction burned the empire to the ground. In 1808, the French army entered the Iberian Peninsula and encountered a problem its logistical rules could not solve. This was asymmetric friction. The French military system relied on the decisive battle. This was a singular event where two organized state armies met on a field and the superior mass won. In Spain, there was no single army to destroy. The French encountered a decentralized, chaotic resistance. This was the birth of the guerrilla, or little war. It was a conflict of constant physical interference. The Spanish resistance was a collection of independent, uncoordinated fighters. These groups ignored the standard laws of battle. They ignored specific towns and refused to maintain supply lines. They functioned as a constant drain on the French occupation. They struck at the messenger routes. These were the fast riders that kept the separated French units in contact. By killing the couriers, the Spanish resistance broke the French communication lines. The individual generals could no longer coordinate with the central command. The empire went blind. This created a massive security requirement. In Germany or Italy, a single soldier could carry a message 50 miles. In Spain, that same message required an escort of 200 cavalrymen just to ensure delivery. This was a catastrophic waste of elite personnel. The horses were ridden to exhaustion just to deliver a piece of paper. The French were forced to commit 300,000 soldiers to the peninsula, yet they never achieved total control of the territory. They occupied the cities. They lost the spaces between the cities. The landscape was filled with a constant, grinding violence that drained the army's strength every single day. The French supply system stalled completely in this environment. The Iberian landscape was rugged, dry, and sparsely populated. The roads were often just rocky paths that shattered the wooden wheels of the supply wagons. There were fewer farms to harvest and fewer villages to strip. The population was actively hostile. They hid their food in the mountains or destroyed it before the French could arrive. The protocol of living off the land turned into a desperate struggle for survival. French units were forced to spread out over dozens of miles just to find sustenance. This made them easy targets for the local resistance. The army was exhausting its daily caloric intake just trying to find enough food to stay in the field. Men began to die of dysentery and starvation in the dry summer heat. The physical wear and tear was immense. The rocky terrain shredded the soles of the soldiers' boots. The extreme temperature swings from baking days to freezing nights in the mountains caused constant illness. The French state struggled to send replacement uniforms and shoes across the Pyrenees Mountains. The French also encountered the physical friction of total urban resistance. The French military system was built for rapid movement across open ground. It was designed to bypass cities or accept their formal surrender. In cities like Zaragoza, the local population refused to surrender. The French were forced to conduct grueling siege warfare. They had to fight street by street and house by house. This type of fighting consumed massive quantities of gunpowder, lead, and artillery shells. It tied down tens of thousands of French soldiers for months to capture a single point on the map. It was an inefficient use of force that bled the army dry. The British capitalized on this friction. They inserted a small professional army under Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, into Portugal. The British functioned as a disciplined corps that the Spanish resistance could rely on. Wellington understood the physical limits of the French attack. He utilized the reverse slope tactic. He hid his infantry behind the crests of hills to neutralize the French artillery. The French cannons fired harmlessly into the dirt. The French infantry would charge upward through the rocky terrain. They would reach the top of the hill, physically exhausted, only to be met by a concentrated wall of British musket fire. Napoleon referred to this conflict as the Spanish ulcer. It was a wound that would not heal. It was a permanent, daily drain on the French state's resources. The elite veterans of Austerlitz and Jena were slowly ground down in meaningless skirmishes. They died in the rocky passes of Navarre and the dry plains of Estremadura. The army lost its most experienced men to sniper fire and disease, rather than grand battles. They were replaced by raw, untrained conscripts who could not handle the extreme physical stress of this constant, irregular warfare. The Spanish ulcer proved that a massive, organized army can be neutralized by enough low-level, continuous interference. The French military system was designed to fight other organized armies. It was completely unsuited to fight a hostile population in a barren, mountainous landscape. By 1812, the French command in Spain was exhausted. The army was still functioning, but it was stretched to its absolute physical breaking point. It was buckling under the stress of 1,000,000 small points of friction, right at the moment Napoleon decided to march his main forces toward the ultimate geographic trap of the Russian East. In 1812, the French army was directed into a geographic wasteland. The invasion of Russia was not a standard military campaign. It was a physical impossibility disguised as a strategic maneuver. Napoleon assembled a force of 600,000 soldiers. He attempted to apply his established rules of movement to a landmass that was simply too large and too empty for those rules to function. This was the entrance into a region where space itself became the primary enemy of the French state. The French military system was built on a specific, inflexible requirement. The army had to extract its daily calories from the villages it passed through. This required a high concentration of farms and granaries. Germany and northern Italy were densely packed with these resources. Russia was an empty expanse. The distances between settlements were too great for a soldier to walk without experiencing a severe caloric deficit. The rapid marching habits that had worked so efficiently in Western Europe were neutralized by the sheer, overwhelming scale of the Russian plains. The army was attempting to find sustenance in a desert of grass and timber. The physical environment began to destroy the army long before the first snow fell. The invasion began in the extreme heat of the Russian summer. The dirt roads turned into rivers of choking dust. Water sources were scarce and often contaminated. The most critical failure, however, was the lack of mature fodder for the horses. The French cavalry and artillery required hundreds of thousands of horses to move. Without dry hay, the horses were forced to eat unripe green crops. This caused severe digestive illness. Tens of thousands of horses died of ruptured stomachs within the first few weeks of the campaign. The transportation network was collapsing under its own physical weight. The Russian command understood that the French soldiers could not survive without local supplies. They initiated a total scorched earth policy. As the French advanced, the Russians dismantled the landscape. They burned the crops in the fields. They slaughtered the livestock and ruined the wells. They evacuated the civilian populations and set fire to the grain stores. The Russian army was not fighting the French soldiers directly. They were systematically destroying the environment the soldiers needed to stay alive. This environmental destruction forced the French to rely on a traditional wagon supply train. This was the exact logistical burden Napoleon had spent a decade trying to eliminate. Managing a wagon train for 600,000 men in a land without paved roads is a mathematical impossibility. The math simply does not work. The horses pulling the supply wagons required their own massive amounts of food. To travel deep into Russia, a supply horse would consume the entire cart of food it was pulling long before it ever reached the front lines. The weight of the supplies required to feed the men exceeded the physical capacity of the animals to deliver it. The physical distance also broke the army's communication lines. In Central Europe, a fast messenger could reach a distant Allied unit in a single day. In the Russian interior, the lines of communication stretched for hundreds of miles through hostile, unmapped territory. A single dispatch required an escort of 200 heavily armed cavalrymen just to prevent it from being intercepted by local resistance. This was a catastrophic drain on the army's best personnel. The different sections of the French army began to lose contact. They were moving blindly through a landscape where the horizon never changed. The army lost its ability to coordinate as a single entity. By the time the army reached the village of Borodino, it had already lost a third of its strength to heat exhaustion, desertion, and disease. Borodino was a massive physical collision of two walls of men and iron. It was the bloodiest single day of the 19th century. The battle resulted in a stalemate of mutual destruction. The French took control of the muddy field, but the cost was the death of their most experienced infantry. The army had reached its physical goal, but it no longer possessed enough men to hold the territory it had just captured. The victory was merely a hollow number on a casualty report. The Russian army was not destroyed. It simply walked further east into the interior. When the French army finally entered Moscow, they expected the conflict to end. They assumed the capture of the capital city would force a political surrender. Instead, they found a ghost city. Within days, the Russians burned Moscow to the ground. The French were now sitting at the furthest physical point of their advance. They were surrounded by smoldering ashes. Their supply lines stretched back 1,000 miles through a burned-out wasteland. There was no government left to talk to. There was no food left to feed the remaining horses. The logistical system had reached its absolute physical limit. The abyss of Russian space had won. Napoleon had driven the world's largest army into a place where the standard rules of military survival did not apply. He had captured every coordinate on the map, yet the Russian army remained intact and invisible in the deep interior. The French army was standing still in an empty, ruined city. It was burning through its last scraps of energy. Meanwhile, the environmental variables began to turn toward the freezing point. The retreat was not a strategic choice. It was the inevitable collapse of an army that had simply run out of road and run out of fuel. Space and distance had proven more lethal than gunpowder. In 1812, the retreat from Moscow became the total physical failure of the French army. As the temperature dropped below freezing, the environment began to dismantle the army's equipment and the soldiers' bodies. This was a breakdown of the material reality of war, completely independent of enemy tactics. The extreme cold changed the chemical properties of everything the army touched. Tin buttons on the uniforms became brittle and crumbled into dust. The heavy wool coats froze solid when wet, becoming rigid blocks of ice that weighed the soldiers down. The lubricants used to keep the wheels of the heavy cannons turning froze solid, locking the guns into place. The iron of the muskets became so cold that it would tear the skin from a soldier's hand if he touched the barrel without gloves. The most catastrophic failure occurred within the army's transport network. Horses were the primary engines of movement in the 19th century. They pulled the food, the ammunition, and the heavy artillery. In the Russian winter, these animals died by the thousands every single night. They could not find grass beneath the frozen crust of the snow. The French had no grain left to feed them. The horses were forced to eat the thatch from the roofs of abandoned cabins, which provided zero caloric value. Without specialized winter horseshoes, the animals slipped on the icy roads and broke their legs. They were immediately slaughtered by the starving soldiers for food. The loss of the horses was the terminal blow to the French army's organization. When a horse died, the transport capacity of that unit died with it. The French were forced to abandon their cannons. They had to leave behind the wagons that contained their remaining food and medicine. The army was no longer an organized military force. It was a moving line of freezing men struggling to maintain enough body heat to stay upright. The landscape was littered with abandoned iron, wood, and gold looted from Moscow. These were the heavy remains of an army that could no longer carry its own weight. Soldiers began to drop their muskets and their heavy packs just to save energy for walking. The human body in sub-zero temperatures requires massive amounts of fuel. To keep the heart beating and the blood flowing in these conditions, a man requires nearly double his normal intake of food. The French soldiers had absolutely nothing. Without external calories, the body begins to consume its own muscle and fat. The soldiers' internal coordination failed. Thousands of men experienced total physical exhaustion. They would sit down in the snow by the side of the road for a moment of rest and never stand up again. The cold would simply shut down their internal organs while they slept. The marching columns walked past them in complete silence, too exhausted to help. This severe physical weakness allowed a secondary, invisible enemy to enter the ranks. This was typhus. This disease thrives in environments where large numbers of people are crowded together without the ability to wash. It is spread by lice that live in the seams of heavy wool uniforms. As the soldiers huddled together in abandoned barns for warmth at night, the lice moved from person to person. They spread the infection rapidly through the weakened population. Typhus causes high fevers, severe dehydration, and total physical exhaustion. For a man already starving and freezing, it was an absolute death sentence. The disease killed more men than the Russian cavalry did during the long march west. The final breakdown of the army's physical cohesion occurred at the Berezina River. The river was filled with floating blocks of ice. The French engineers were required to stand chest deep in the freezing water to construct wooden pontoon bridges. Many of the engineers died of hypothermia within minutes. When the bridges were finally completed, the remaining soldiers rushed across in a panicked mass. The strict discipline that defined the French military system completely evaporated. Men pushed each other into the freezing water to save themselves. When the Russian artillery began firing on the crossing, the bridges were destroyed, trapping thousands of stragglers on the eastern bank. The army had ceased to exist as a unified entity. It was now merely a collection of desperate individuals trying to survive. The retreat was a journey through a graveyard of the army's own making. Of the 600,000 men who had crossed into Russia, only about 100,000 returned. Most of those survivors were permanently disabled. They had lost fingers, toes, and ears to severe frostbite. Their lungs were permanently damaged by inhaling the frozen air. The French military system had been designed for the warmth of the Mediterranean and the rich agricultural harvests of Central Europe. It was built for a world that followed predictable logistical rules. It could not survive the absolute zero of the Russian interior. The Grande Armée had been erased by the basic laws of thermodynamics. The army had been driven into a region where it could not find fuel. Then it was frozen until its physical structure shattered. By the time the survivors reached the safety of the border, the power of the French state had effectively evaporated. The men were gone. The horses were dead. The heavy equipment was left behind in the snow. The logistical system had reached its absolute end. The destruction of the army in Russia was not the immediate end of the conflict. It was merely the beginning of a massive 2-year collapse. Between 1813 and 1814, the French state was forced into a grinding, defensive retreat across Germany and then into France itself. This period consumed the last remaining physical resources of the empire. The mature horse population was entirely depleted. The veteran soldiers who survived the cold were eventually killed in a dozen smaller battles. The empire was physically dismantled by the sheer combined mass of its enemies. Napoleon was forced into exile, and the borders of Europe were redrawn. In 1815, Napoleon returned to Paris for one final, desperate application of military force. The French army was reconstituted, but its physical composition had fundamentally changed. The new army was filled with younger conscripts who lacked the physical endurance of the previous generation. There was a critical shortage of cavalry horses and draft animals. The logistical supply network was a fraction of its former scale. The math of the empire was permanently broken. This final campaign culminated in the Battle of Waterloo. It was the terminal event for the French state. It was a battle decided entirely by the physical factors of terrain, weather, and absolute human exhaustion. Napoleon's strategy relied on a specific geographic separation. He needed to strike the Anglo-Allied force under the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian army under Gebhard von Blücher before they could merge. If the two enemy armies combined, their sheer physical mass would overwhelm the French. Napoleon had to defeat them individually. He successfully pushed the Prussians back at the village of Ligny. He then turned his entire focus toward Wellington at the coordinates of Waterloo. The physical environment intervened immediately. Heavy rain fell continuously the night before the battle. The Belgian fields absorbed the water, turning the soil into deep, heavy mud. As we have seen, French tactical success relied entirely on the kinetic power of field artillery. For maximum lethality, a solid iron cannonball needed to strike dry, hard ground and bounce horizontally through the enemy ranks. In the thick mud of Waterloo, the round shot simply buried itself in the wet earth. The kinetic energy was completely absorbed by the soil. Napoleon recognized this physical limitation. He delayed the start of the battle for several hours. He was waiting for the morning sun and the wind to dry the ground. This delay was a fatal mathematical error in timing. Every hour the French waited was an hour the Prussian army used to march toward the battlefield. The French were trading time for artillery effectiveness. Time was the one physical resource they did not possess. Wellington was an expert in defensive geography. He applied the exact same spatial tactic he had utilized against the French during the long years of the Spanish ulcer. He positioned his troops on the reverse slope of a long ridge called Mont Saint-Jean. This physical barrier hid his infantry from the French artillery. The French cannons were forced to fire blindly over the crest of the hill. When the French infantry finally advanced, they had to march across a wide valley and then walk uphill. The thick mud clung to their boots. Every step required massive caloric energy. The soldiers were carrying heavy woolen coats soaked with rain, along with 60 pounds of physical equipment. By the time the French soldiers reached the top of the ridge, they were physically exhausted. They walked directly into a concentrated wall of British musket fire. The battle reached a state of maximum physical friction during the afternoon cavalry charges. The French sent thousands of heavily armored cavalrymen against the British infantry. The British responded by forming hollow defensive squares. These were dense blocks of men with bayonets pointing outward in every direction. Without the support of their own infantry or artillery, the French horses refused to charge directly into the wall of steel. The horses flowed around the squares like water moving around rocks. The French cavalry spent hours slowly circling the British formations in the deep mud. This exhausted the horses and the riders for zero physical gain. The French cavalry was permanently ruined. Late in the afternoon, the delayed Prussian army finally arrived on the French right flank. The French army was now forced to fight in two directions at once. The physical mass of the enemy was overwhelming. Napoleon had one final resource to spend. He ordered his Imperial Guard forward. These were the tallest, strongest, and most experienced soldiers left in France. They had never been defeated in combat. The Imperial Guard marched uphill through the mud, stepping over the bodies of the previous failed attacks. As they crested the ridge, hidden British guardsmen stood up and fired massive, synchronized volleys of lead directly into their columns. The physical impact was devastating. The elite French infantry stalled under the sheer weight of the fire. For the first time in their history, the Imperial Guard broke and retreated down the hill. This visual collapse triggered a wave of panic across the entire French line. The cry of retreat broke the psychological cohesion of the army. The strict discipline that held the force together completely evaporated. The French army disintegrated into a chaotic mass of fleeing men. Waterloo was the moment the arithmetic of the Napoleonic era finally reached zero. The French state had run out of time, space, and men. The logistical advantages that had allowed them to dominate Europe for 2 decades were permanently neutralized. They were defeated by the physical reality of the muddy battlefield and the absolute exhaustion of their own population. The terminal event was complete. The end of the French military system provides a clear record of physical limits. Over the last hour, we watched a single nation organize itself into a highly efficient logistical entity. We traced the rapid projection of force across the European continent. We also witnessed the inevitable collapse. The history of this era proves that a system requiring endless physical expansion will always hit the geographic boundaries of the Earth. The central command of the empire was permanently dismantled, but the administrative framework remained. Today, the modern world still operates within the structures established during those 20 years of conflict. The metric system continues to dictate the math of global trade, removing the friction of local measurements. The concept of standardized written law replaced the unpredictable chaos of feudal privilege. Furthermore, modern organizations still rely on the blueprint of the corps d'armée. Massive, overwhelming tasks are still divided into smaller, self-sustaining units capable of independent movement. The primary reflection we draw from the Napoleonic Wars is the absolute superiority of physical reality over human ambition. History often focuses on grand strategy or the brilliance of a single commander. The cold historical record tells a different story. Ambition is eventually neutralized by deep mud, freezing temperatures, and the heavy mathematical weight of supply wagons. The Earth always wins the war of attrition. Distance and time are the ultimate limits on human action. There is a deep comfort in understanding these limits. You do not need to conquer the map. You do not need to operate at maximum efficiency at all times. The history we just reviewed demonstrates that constant, rapid expansion is entirely unsustainable. Eventually, every entity must stop moving. The crisis of that era is permanently closed. The ledgers are finalized, and the lessons are safely recorded in the archives. There is nothing left for you to calculate tonight. It is time to accept the limits of the day. Close your eyes, let go of the timeline, and rest.